Sheffield is a city built on stories. You only need to walk along the local streets to find this out. Arundelgate, Fitzallen Square, Norfolk Street, all named after the earls who made Sheffield great. And perhaps this number could be added George Talbot, 6th Earl of Shrewsbury, one of the richest men in the kingdom, captor of Mary Queen of Scots and possessor, so his letters tell us, of a very strong Sheffield accent and one of the strongest cases of bad handwriting you will ever see. But for now, I'm not going to talk about these men. Instead, I'm going to talk about two commoners, two humble men who nevertheless grew up within Sheffield and left an indelible mark on its landscape. Because this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of two Kelhams. Now, we don't know what the relationship is between Kelham Homer Jr. and Kelham Homer Sr., although it is probably likely that they were nephew and uncle. However, we do know three things. First of all, they were both armourers, both living within the castle, looking after the town's armour and that of the Earl, because they were the Earl's men. In fact, Kelham Homer Jr.'s father was even called George after the 6th Earl of Shrewsbury. But far more importantly at this stage of our story is the fact that these two men were both foreigners. Now, perhaps you're thinking foreign as in maybe from the Netherlands or perhaps France. But no, these two men had the mistake, or misfortune as you will see it, of coming from Worcestershire. Because a foreigner during this period is just someone who isn't from around here. And as people from Worcestershire, the two Kelhams were, well, quite frankly, not from around here. So they're already seen with great suspicion by the townspeople. And you'd think that as a result of this, they'd quite happily keep their heads down and live a quiet life. Well, as we'll see throughout this story, a quiet life is not for the Kelhams. In 1609, in the town's records, we have an entry that states as follows. Item, a pane laid that Kelham Homer nor any of his tenants shall grind nor glace, neither night nor day, but they shall draw the by-shuttle to let the water pass until the corn mill, unless they keep their own wheel going with sufficient water for the said corn mill. In pain of every such default, 10 shillings. Well, what does this mean? Well, the island on which Kelham has built his mill is in fact an artificial one that was probably formed in the 13th century, if not before, and it's formed from where water is taken from the River Don, is fed downstream through the aforesaid corn mill, and then out again to rejoin the River Don just above Ladysbridge. So, if you put a mill above the corn mill, this means that you can't get the water through with sufficient force to turn the corn mill's wheels. Now, without turning the corn mill's wheels, you can't grind the corn. Without grinding the corn, you can't make the flour. Without making the flour, you can't make bread. Which is a bit of a problem when this is your only corn mill that feeds the entire town on which it all depends for the bread. So, in 1609, we have Kelham Homer, a brown-nosed servant of the Lord, who is a foreigner to boot, who's now had the gumption to stop the corn mill from functioning and thereby the townspeople from eating. Unsurprisingly, he is not a particularly popular man. Now, it would appear that Kelham learned his lesson, because this is the last time that we ever hear of this problem throughout the records, and in fact the mill survives long enough for the island to be named after its owner, and thus Kelham Island gets its name. Now, you'd have thought that the Kelhams would have learnt by now that the way to get along is to keep your head down. Well, Kelham Sr. might have learnt his lesson, but evidently he had not told his nephew. Let's fast forward 3.5 decades. February 1642. The Earls of Shrewsbury have long since died and instead been replaced by the Earls of Arundel, who are Catholic sympathisers at a time when to be a Catholic is at best unwise and at worst tantamount to treason. Because now we are firmly in the build-up to war. In 6 months' time, in August 1642, Charles I is going to declare war on his own parliament. And as a result, the country and town is divided between Catholic sympathisers and the King on one hand and parliamentarians and Puritans on the other. And you'd have thought that at this time of strife, once again, Kelham Homer would have kept his head down. Well, not so. If Kelham Sr. had annoyed the town council, Kelham Jr. is about to go one higher and gets told off by the highest authority in the land. 14th of February 1642, a letter written to Sir Thomas Fairfax, who is about to become one of the most prominent parliamentarian commanders, is read out in Parliament. It reads as follows: "There are arms of the Earl of Arundel's in the custody of one Jackson, a convicted Catholic, and that one Kelham Homer, an armour dresser, that hath the charge of dressing these arms, hath lately spoken these words, that, before May Day, they should hear such a peal rung in Sheffield as had not been heard these 100 years." Now, when it says here, a peal rung in Sheffield, we're not talking about a peal of bells to celebrate a marriage or a christening or anything quite so joyful. Oh no, this is a peal of bells that, so Parliament think, is going to herald the rise of a Catholic army that, at best, is going to create havoc in Sheffield and the rest of South Yorkshire, and, at worst, going to cause rebellion, the like of which has not been seen since the Gunpowder Plot. And what's worse is that the very arms and armour to fund and to back this rebellion is actually in the hot hands of Jackson and Kelham Homer. Parliament need to act fast, and so they do. They remove all the armour and arms from the castle, and as a result, the rebellion, or would-be rebellion, is quickly quashed. Now, this all happens before August 1642, but you can see that even before war is declared, we have got a divided town. On the one side, we have Parliament and its supporters, many of whom live in Sheffield and are about to garrison the castle. On the other side, we have Kelham Homer. Well, it's not exactly like he's unused to it by now. And so here we have a scene set for war. Now, given the fact that all the armour and arms has already been removed by Parliament, it is perhaps unsurprising that in 1643, when the Royalists turn up in Sheffield again, the parliamentarians within the castle have got nothing to fight them with, and as a result, quickly surrender. And that's how it is for about a year, until 1644, the parliamentarians return, and they bring with them the Queen's pocket pistol, a 100-year cannon, 8 metres long, capable of causing fearsome damage. And it is hardly surprising that, having seen this gun and the damage it can do, the Royalists quite quietly give up. Now, when a side gives up, you have what is called an Articles of Surrender. This is effectively a contract between those who have surrendered and those who receive the surrender. Those who are surrendering say, we give up, we're not going to fight anymore, you can have all our weapons, and in return, the besiegers go, right, well, in which case, we'll grant you fair passage. And these are normally quite standard, apart from in Sheffield's case. Because within this, we have the following item, that Kelham Homer, yes, him again, now living in the castle, shall have liberty to remove his goods into the town or elsewhere without molestation. In other words, Kelham Homer, far from learning his lesson, has not gone away and hidden for the rest of the war, but in fact has been actively supporting the Royalists, has probably been making them arms and armour within the castle, and as a result has probably annoyed the local populace to such an extent that he has to be personally guaranteed safety, because otherwise who else knows what would happen. Now that is the end of Kelham Homer in Sheffield. We never ever hear of him again within the town records, and in 1646, where once his wages would have appeared, there is now one sad solitary line. But that's not quite the end of the story, because now we're going to move to the 11th of October 1649 and the parish records of Worksop, one of the Earl of Arundel's chief holdings. And here we have Kelham Homer, and joy of joys, he has had a son who he is going to christen. Now remember, this is October 1649. In the previous January, Charles I has had his head chopped off, and we are now under the control firmly of Oliver Cromwell and Parliament. So, what do we name this son? Oliver, perhaps. Or maybe Thomas Fairfax, after the leader of the parliamentarian forces. Well, this is Kelham Homer we're talking about, so of course he calls his son Charles. Now, unfortunately, Charles doesn't live long enough to see the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, when his namesake Charles II regains the throne. But Kelham does, living indeed until 1674, when he dies at the age of 61, happily in the knowledge that he had lived a life which, whilst unconventional, was at least lived on his own terms until the very last. This then is the end of the story of Kelham Homer. But it is not, of course, the only story on which Sheffield is built. And should you want to hear any more of these, such as perhaps Alice Hall, the first female cutler, or perhaps Widow Revel, who ran the town's mills during the Civil War, or perhaps even the Earl of Shrewsbury himself, then perhaps you'd be interested in downloading and using Sheffield Lives, a new walking app around Sheffield Centre that charts its development during the 16th and 17th centuries. Thank you.